we are going to start with the presentation of Mr. Carl Carlson. He is in the call. Hello, Carl from the Netherlands.
Hello from state of Michigan, USA.
Okay, it's great to have you here in this audience and give us your light about good and bad FMEAs. So I would say, take it away.
Okay, first of all, let me make sure you can see this okay, and I'll go into presentation mode. And you tell me if this is showing up. There we go. Okay, so I'm very pleased to be here and present at this FMEA seminar. This is a subject about which I feel a great deal of passion in my life, failure mode and effects analysis. And I appreciate the help that Jos and Hiron have provided to get this set up with me. First, a word about myself, and then we'll go right into the presentation. I've been involved in reliability engineering and management for over 35 years. Worked as manager of product reliability at General Motors for a number of years. In the last 20 years, I've been working with a wide variety of clients in industries across the world, and reliability and FMEA teaching and consulting. And I'm a certified reliability engineer, so I'm going to teach and talk about FMEA from the point of view of risk management and reliability, as well as the fundamentals of FMEA. I'm also sitting on a number of the international FMEA standards committees. So I'll be sharing with you the subject of FMEA from the point of view of how it's done very well from standards. So with that very short introduction, let me start with the presentation. And I want to begin with a quote. Thomas Edison, when he was developing the light bulb in the United States, was under a lot of pressure, a lot of funding and this type of thing, and he hadn't developed it yet. So he kind of bristled and said to people that asked him about it, he says, I haven't failed. I found 10,000 ways that don't work. And the reason I'm starting with that quote is because FMEA is all about understanding how things fail. Because if you understand how things don't work, you can design them so they do. And then I'll also talk about one of my favorite sayings, if anything can go wrong, it will. Some people call it Murphy's Law, other people just say it's an ancient adage. But the whole point here is it pays to anticipate problems and solve them during product development. So what's our objective today? We have 45 minutes, and so we'll only be beginning the introduction to this whole subject because there's lots more we could talk about on the quality of FMEAs. But I will introduce an FMEA audit process that highlights the difference between high quality FMEAs and poor quality FMEAs. And this is one of my passions because I've seen so many FMEAs that don't meet the standard of quality. And I think we should all aspire to that standard. Okay, so today we'll talk about what is FMEA very briefly. And because I think we have to start with fundamentals. And then I'll share with you the 10 most common FMEA mistakes that I've seen and a lot of companies have seen, and I bet you've seen in your practice. Now we'll look at those mistakes and turn them into quality objectives, which then become the essence of an effective FMEA audit process. And then for some fun here, we'll have an actual audit exercise. We only have time for 2 of the quality objectives, but we'll participate in that together. And then I'll summarize, and then we'll go into questions and answers. So be sure to be formulating questions. Those that in the live audience will have a way for you to ask questions, and then the remote audience as well. You can use the chat feature. And the thing I want to stress here is that if we only have a certain amount of time, so we'll have time for a few questions, but be thinking of questions because I'll show you how to send those to me if we don't have time for your questions today, and I will answer every question that you have by email if they don't get answered during the presentation. And then I want to state before we begin that it's my intention that each and every person that's here today walks away with a higher knowledge about the quality of FMEAs. So join me in that journey. And here we go. So we're going to start with a couple of surveys. This is just a very simple thing, and Joost, feel free to jump in at any time here. But on this, go right ahead.
Perhaps I may ask the audience, please get your mobile and scan the QR code, and then 2 questions will pop up, and try to answer within 15-20 seconds. So, okay, I think it's more or less already clear. 43% is interested in design FMEAs, and 57 in process FMEAs. So okay. Focus is on slightly on process FMEAs, right?
I appreciate that, and thank you for that, Joost. And I appreciate the background of people, because the way we'll do this today is I'll put the emphasis on the exercise on the process FMEA, but I'll talk about the quality of FMEAs from both design and process standpoint. Yeah. Okay, well, so here's the.
Let's also go to the second question, I guess. Yeah. And here you see the second coming up. So it seems that we have a pretty experienced FMEA audience here. 12% is new to FMEA. Approximately 42 has some experience, 1 to 5 FMEAs. And the majority, 48%, has participated in more than 6 FMEAs. So pretty experienced.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm so happy that we have a varied audience, and that some of you are quite experienced. And so, and that is a insight to me as to how deeply I approach this. So thank you so much for that participation in the survey.
You're welcome. And later on, with the audit exercise, we come back with this Mentimeter survey. 2 more questions. Okay.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Joost. We'll start with what is FMEA. So much could be said here. I do tutorials at the annual Reliability and Maintainability Symposium on FMEA, and this could take hours of time to get deeply, but I'll just show a few slides just to touch on this. One of my favorite quotes from Albert Einstein is, "Intellectuals solve problems, geniuses prevent them." So let's focus on preventing problems. Definition of FMEA. When I teach the subject, I ask the students to remember these 3 bullets about what an FMEA is. Whether it's design FMEA, process FMEA, software FMEA, whatever it is, I want to identify and fully understand potential failure modes and their causes, and the effects of failure on the system for a given product or process. The second thing is we assess the risk associated with the identified failure modes, effects, and causes, and prioritize issues for corrective action. And the third thing is identify and carry out corrective actions to address the most serious concerns. So we want to do all 3 of those. I've seen FMEAs that do just the first one, some that do the first and second, but we need to do all 3 of them, because the end result is we want to reduce risk to an acceptable level. Continuing about FMEA, it's an engineering analysis performed by a cross-functional team of subject matter experts, thoroughly analyzing product designs or manufacturing processes. Performed early in the product development process, whether you're doing design FMEA or process FMEA, we want to get it done as early as possible, finding and correcting weaknesses, and here's the key, before the product gets into the hands of the customer. Now, that was what an FMEA is, but it's also important to know what an FMEA isn't. It's not a checkbox activity. Now, I'm thinking back to my General Motors days. I had responsibility for FMEA as well as reliability and a lot of supplier activity. And back then in the early years, FMEA was mostly checkbox. And that's one of the things I worked on very hard, is to turn it into a viable, useful tool, not a fill out the form activity. certainly not a one-person analysis. And we don't want it to be a last-minute exercise that you're rushed to do to meet a contract or do it to satisfy the customer job. Now, I can see the audience here, and I really appreciate that camera feed. So let me ask you, if you just raise your hand, has anybody seen FMEAs that are done for any of these reasons? Just raise your hand if you have. Okay, and I'm raising my hand as well. Thank you very much. So, yeah, absolutely. Okay, and of course, do they add value? No, they don't, if you do that. So we're going to focus on FMEAs that add value. Continuing on, the case for FMEA, I would say FMEA has the potential to achieve safe, reliable, economical products if it's performed on the right parts, by the right team, during the correct time frame, with the right procedure, and according to defined quality objectives. So this presentation will focus on that last bullet that you have here. And I'll say it another way here. I'm seeing over my career 6 broad success factors that are critical to getting success in the application of FMEA. First, and I ask that all of you aspire to these 6. 1, understand the fundamentals and procedures of FMEA. There's so many resources that you can use to do that. I'll share some of those resources at the end. Selecting the right FMEA projects. I don't think FMEAs need to be done on everything. I think we have to select the right projects, and there's a lot has been written on that subject. I want to prepare for FMEA projects. I usually say that as much time can be used in preparation for FMEAs as actually conducting the meetings, because preparation is so important. The 4th of 6 is applying lessons learned and quality objectives. And this is the subject of this presentation. The 5th, and it's always important, is to be led by a good facilitator. It doesn't have to be a person who's only a facilitator. In other words, they can be skilled, they should be in FMEA and aware and skilled in your product, but they should also be skilled in facilitation. Lastly, and this is important for management, is we need an effective company-wide FMEA process. So I'm going to today focus on number 4. So what are the most common mistakes? Think back to the FMEAs you've seen and what are the mistakes that you've seen and how do we turn them into quality objectives? So this is not a perfect list of mistakes, but I'll share with you 10 common ones. And then we'll look at how we can turn them into quality objectives. And we'll also look at what we can do to audit FMEAs using the quality objectives. The first mistake, let me state, here's a quote: good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from poor judgment. So by that statement, I will say I'm very experienced in FMEA. I've done all of these mistakes myself over the years, and I bet you've done some of them as well. Excuse me a second while I stay hydrated. The first mistake is failure to drive design or process improvements. Some FMEAs don't drive any action at all. I was at a client years ago that I was asked to teach FMEA and to consult. This was a large company, very well known, and their FMEA recommendations column was blank. Now, that's not a very good idea, because if you're doing an FMEA, there's a certain amount of risk involved. And so we want to see recommendations that drive design or process improvements. So the quality objective number 1, the FMEA drives product design or manufacturing improvements as the primary objective. So keep that in mind. Always aspire towards that quality objective. Now, how do we audit? Very simple. Look at the recommendations column. Observe whether or not many of them drive design or process improvements. Be aware of that. All these audit quality objectives you can use when you're doing FMEAs or when you're reviewing FMEAs, when you're looking at supplier FMEAs, if you're tier 1 looking at tier 2s, and when you're teaching. That's number 1. Number 2, failure to address all high-risk failure modes. I recall years ago, I was working with a company developing laser products, and they had a known failure mode that didn't come up during the FMEA meetings. And I was that back then I was facilitating, and I could catch from the body language that they were holding back. I said, what is it that you're not telling me? And they said, well, we have this failure mode that we can't do anything about, so we didn't want to bring it up. I said, no. You always want to bring it up. And because we're going to use the FMEA process to discover more and to get to root cause and to fix the problem. So they did, and it went very well. So we want to be sure all high-risk failure modes are addressed, and the procedure requires that they are addressed with recommended actions. So number 2, quality objective, the FMEA addresses all high-risk failure modes as identified by the team with executable action plans. Now, how do we audit that? We want to review high severity and high RPN if you're using RPN, and there's the asterisk saying it's no longer being used in many FMEA standards. So there are other techniques to prioritize risk, but I'll just use it in this presentation if you're using RPN. High severity and high RPN. Now remember, high severity and low RPN issues can still be high risk. So one of the flaws of RPN, risk priority number, is that high severity, low RPN can get missed. So we don't want to prioritize just by RPN or just by SOD. We want to also look at severity by itself in order to understand what the risk is. And I'll then take a look to see, do the recommendations in the FMEA reduce risk to an acceptable level? That's number 2. Number 3 is failure to improve test or control plans. I remember back in my early years at General Motors, I was a manager of a test lab there, and we tested doors, and every time we tested the doors, they passed. But in the field, there were a lot of door problems. So what do you know? You know something's wrong with the tests. And we can use FMEA to identify what's wrong with the tests, because that goes in the design controls column for designs or process control column for the process FMEAs. And so some companies miss that opportunity to improve test or control plans based on failure modes from the FMEA. Use the FMEA as to improve your design verification plan or your process control plan by considering the failure modes from the FMEA. And how do you audit? Again, this can show up in the recommendations column. So you look where the detection rating is high. That's the ability of the tests or the controls to detect the problem. And then use recommendations column to improve the testing or the process control plans. Very, very important auditing point. Number 4, not including interfaces. Empirical data shows at least 50% of field problems can occur at interfaces. Some companies focus on component or subsystem failures and miss the interfaces. I have found I've worked with well over 100 companies on FMEA quality and teaching and consulting, and every company I've worked with has well over 50% of the problems occurring at interfaces. If you only look at the components and not the interfaces, you're going to miss half the problems. So the quality objective is the FMEA scope includes integration and interface failure modes in the block diagram, which is the visual representation, as well as the analysis. How do you audit? Review the block diagram or the visual representation to ensure all needed interfaces are identified, and examine the FMEA to ensure there is correlation between the interfaces and the actual functions in the FMEA. So it becomes interface functions. Number 5, disconnect from field lessons learned. Boy, that's a big one. How many times have we seen problems repeated? I've seen in automotive years, I've seen the times when we've had huge recalls of the same problem year after year, and that's not good. So you want to use the FMEA to make sure you don't repeat known problems. That's not the only reason, of course, but that's a big one. So the quality objective is the FMEA considers all major lessons learned, such as high warranty, or in the case of PFMEA, assembly issues, as input to failure mode identification. So how do you audit this? You're going to review the failure modes and causes to ensure they contain supplemental field or plant data. Talk with the FMEA team to ensure that this is done. Verify actions taken to ensure high-risk issues will not be repeated. That's number 5. Number 6, wrong level of detail. Some FMEAs go into too much detail. I don't know what the longest FMEA you've ever seen is, but I've seen FMEAs that are 1,000 pages long. That's almost useless. So you want to get the right level of detail. I teach that each column of the FMEA should be well enough described in good enough detail to get to the next column. And so we don't want to write long treatises on FMEA. We want to get to the points in the right level of detail. So that experience really helps here. The quality objective is the FMEA provides the correct level of detail to get to root causes and effective actions. How do you audit? I look at the different columns of the FMEA and evaluate if the level of detail is proper and adequate to understand root causes and effective corrective actions. So I'm really big on the subject of getting to root causes, both in the DFMEA and the PFMEA. Number 7, boy, I think we've all done this one, doing FMEAs late. Many companies do FMEAs late. That reduces their effectiveness. FMEAs should be completed by design or process freeze dates. So you want to get your FMEA done, risk reduced to an acceptable level by those freeze dates in your product development process. The quality objective is the FMEA is completed during the window of opportunity where it can most effectively impact the product or process design. This is pretty easy to audit. Let's look at the timing of the project against the product development process timing gates. Verify the FMEA is started and completed in the proper time frame. Now I say it's easy to audit. It's not easy to do. So when you audit FMEAs and look at the quality, you want to be sure you're seeing clearly what actually is happening. Number 8, inadequate team composition. I don't know if any of you have done this. I know I have early on, trying to get that FMEA done by myself or just a couple of people. The mistake is inadequate team composition. There's a reason why you want a cross-functional team. People have blind spots. I've learned that over and over in my career, and a cross-functional team will mitigate the blind spots that everybody has. Some teams don't have the right experts, some don't have good attendance. So the quality objective is the right people participate on the FMEA team throughout the analysis and are adequately trained in the procedure. So we're going to look at, in auditing this, we'll look at the roster of the FMEA and look at the meeting participation and verify that it's done properly with the right cross-functional team. Number 9, the improper procedure. There are hundreds of ways to do FMEAs wrong. Each column of the FMEA must be completed according to fundamentals of FMEA. So when and the quality objective is it's properly done. I call it by the book, in other words, by your standards, including all the way through action taken and risk reduced to an acceptable level. I look at all the columns of the FMEA. Are functions described well? Failure modes? Is it faithful to the fundamentals? Is it faithful to your standards? Auditing this, and that I've just described how I do that. Number 10, this is one of the last ones that I learned. I learned this the hard way, which is lack of efficient use of time. Some companies mandate FMEAs to ensure the time's well spent. If team members feel the FMEA takes too long, the FMEA will not be supported. So the quality objective is the time spent by the team is an effective, efficient use of time with a value-added result. And I audit this by talking with the team, and I look them in the eye and I say, was this a value-added result to you? Is this a good return on your investment of time? If not, we find out why. Okay, so I won't read these again because this is just a summary. And by the way, these slides will be available for viewing by participants. So they'll be summarized here, but this is the same information I just told you. So now let's turn to an effective FMEA audit process. In one page, I'll describe it this way. It's performed by somebody who has expertise in FMEA. You can do it on a pre-scheduled or random basis. I've done this with companies randomly. I say, okay, let's look at your FMEAs. Or I've also done it on pre-scheduled. It's time for an audit. Evaluate the content of selected FMEAs against quality objectives. Look at the worksheet columns, talk to the team. You assess each quality objective on a 1, 2, 3, or you could do 1 to 5. Some people use red, yellow, green. Where a 1 is it's not in place, 2 is the quality objectives partially in place, and 3 is the quality objective is fully in place. I realize that's qualitative, and that's the point, is we want to use your expertise to assess how good you are at achieving the quality objectives. I've never seen a company that has all 10 in place at the beginning. So you want to work and aspire towards getting these in place. Now, the output of the audit provides valuable feedback to improve the future FMEAs. I don't want to use the audit to criticize the team. I want to use the audit to get insight into the FMEA process and work on improving it. And it can take 1 to 2 hours. That's not a lot of time to invest. You can summarize it like this, but the key here is the follow-up tasks. Understand what you've seen in the audit and develop tasks to improve the FMEA process. Now we'll do a practice audit. We have 2 surveys we're going to do, but I want to show you what the audit is. And after I explain the quality objectives, we're going to pick 2 randomly quality objectives, and I'll explain that to you. Then I'll put this slide back on so you can see it. In the preparation, this is a fictitious PFMEA on an O-ring lubrication by the plant that is assembling a natural gas fitting, performed by a process engineer and plant tooling assistant. They've read the FMEA procedure before starting. It's completed about a week before start of production. And a single line excerpt. So we're only looking at 1 line right here in this practice. We don't have time to go into much more than that. But the process step is to apply the lubrication to the O-ring. The function is lube the O-ring with ABC lubricant using XYZ specification. Failure mode, insufficient lubrication. The effect could be serious. Gas leak at fitting with potential for operator injury, or the system's inoperable in the field. Cause, remember this, lubrication gun calibration is incorrect due to calibration procedure not followed. There's a prevention control, which is the in-plant lube gun calibration, and a detection control end-of-line pressure testing with the severity 10, very serious, occurrence 5, that's way too often, and detection 5, they're having trouble detecting. There's one recommended action here, follow the in-plant lube gun calibration procedure. So this is a PFMEA. We're going to evaluate how good it is in these 2 surveys. We'll only look at 2 quality objectives. So I'll describe the first one, and then Jos, you can add in to guide them. The quality objective 1 will evaluate, which is, does this PFMEA drive process improvements as the primary objective? So we're going to look at recommended actions and observe whether they drive process improvements, because we're looking at a PFMEA. Survey, assess how well. So we're going to look, you're going to decide 1, 2, or 3, how well this single line excerpt meets the quality objective number 1, which is to drive process improvements. So I'm going to go, and this is the QR code, and now I'm going to leave this in place once you've opened this up, and Jos, you can help me out here. I'll leave this.
We all know how it works, eh?
Okay.
So here you've got the description of the practice audit again. So already results coming in. Okay, it remains now a little bit stable. 40% says, somewhat less, 36, this quality objective is not in place. 50, it's 55 approximately, quality objective is partially in place. And a few people say that for 5% approximately, quality objective is fully in place. So preference for partially in place.
Excellent, very, very good. So let's look at what I thought. I thought this was not in place, but I can understand partially. So there's a very close call here. The reason I said I thought it was not in place is because the sole recommended action was actually the prevention control. So they're already doing it by definition. The prevention control is already in place and they're saying that's a recommended action. So they didn't really drive any change. So that's why I said it was not in place, but they're at least doing something, so I could understand why some people would say partially. And now, what's the recommendation here? What should this be? The cause, if you remember, is the lubrication gun calibration is incorrect due to calibration procedure not followed. I want the recommendations in an FMEA to fix the cause. So you're going to be looking for actions that drive process improvement on a PFMEA. And then you would be looking to see, are we fixing the cause? Which something should be done to improve that calibration procedure that's not being followed. Okay, so thank you very much for that one. We have time for a second one, and then we'll have time for a few questions when we're done. So quality objective number 8. Remember this one, the right people adequately trained in the procedure participate on the team throughout the analysis. Now, what did we have? We're going to look at the team membership to ensure that it's adequate, and you'll do the same type of 1, 2, 3, not in place, partially in place, fully in place. But remember this, the team was process engineer and plant tooling assistant. So go ahead now and open up your survey and decide on a 1, 2, or 3, where 1 is not in place, 2 is partially, 3 is fully. And I'll leave this up for you to look at while you do your survey. And Jos, I appreciate if you can share with me the feedback.
Yeah, approximately 55% says quality objective is not in place. 40% says objective is partially in place. And 5% says that the objective is fully in place. So a preference for not in place, 55%.
Very good. So really 95% say it's not in place or partially in place. And that really opens up the door to the point of the exercise, because we can do something about that. And I'm agreeing with this. The rationale, of course, is that let me get the right one here. For number 8, I had partially in place on this one, sorry, number 8, because there are at least 2 team members. I've seen ones where there's only 1, but it's a close call. But the point is that we can do something about it. The FMEA process should be improved to provide proper cross-functional team. For example, this PFMEA could include a subject matter expert who understands natural gas fittings. This was not the case. So better than one person doing it, but a lot of improvement is possible here to get a proper cross-functional team. Okay. Summarizing now, because we're now down to the last 10 minutes of the presentation, I'll summarize and we'll have time for a few questions. The most common FMEA mistakes can be learned and avoided. Good FMEAs achieve defined quality objectives, bad FMEAs don't. Excuse me. An FMEA quality audit process can help ensure each and every FMEA is high quality and effective. Now, I want to leave with this statement, is that I would hope you could make it your personal mission to improve the FMEA quality wherever you can, no matter what your job is. You can influence the quality of FMEAs by aspiring to quality objectives and implementing an audit process in your company or in your job, in your role. So with that summary, let me just share with you more information. If you want to read a lot, this is all free. I'm not trying to sell anything here. This is all useful information, I think. But www.effectivefmeas.com will take you to a series of useful articles and aids, including more information about auditing FMEAs and the quality of FMEAs. I've also written Inside FMEA articles on the website accendoreliability.com, which are all no charge, and you'll get some of the same articles that I've written on quality objectives and FMEA audits and lots of other subjects on FMEAs. And if you have a question that's not answered today, my email, and I answer every question that people ask on FMEA. Don't send me anything confidential. carl.carlson@effectivefmeas.com. And because I enjoy answering questions, there's no charge on that. It's just an enjoyment to me, and we can dialogue about questions that people have. So if anything doesn't get answered today, use that email to follow up. Now we have about 10 minutes, 9 minutes really, for questions and answers. So I'm going to look to yourself if you've seen any on the chat feature, and then we'll also have time for people to raise their hand if we want to go that way as well. Okay, so over to you, Jos, to help me on this part of it.
Well, Carl, Saskia is here. I'm going to help with the Q&A section.
Okay,
I think you
good.
can see me over there. Hey, but first, let's give a warm applause to Carl Carlson.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, I am sure that we have questions for Carl. Who wants to go first? I see a question over there. One moment, Carl. We're bringing a microphone to the questionnaire.
You very nicely explained how we can recognize a poor FMEA and all the wrong reasons for doing it poor. If you were at a company not doing FMEAs, what would be your, let's say, your pitch to management to start doing them, and how to would they then, well, bring benefit to their bottom line?
Excellent question. That's very good. And I have been at companies like that. I always start by understanding the company. In other words, I wouldn't walk in cold. And part of understanding is understanding what their warranty issues are, what kind of field problems they've had, also the new technology that they're introducing, the new applications, because those are the things that trigger FMEAs. And we'll talk about prevention to management and say and I always want to talk dollars. And I say dollars. Here I am in the United States talking dollars. I'm sorry about that. You can talk euros, however we want to talk. We want to talk money to management because that's what they understand. And failures cost money. You lose customers. And so I want to work with them to prevent problems. And FMEA is the best tool to prevent problems. So they don't have high warranty expense and they don't have legal issues, safety issues, and they retain their customers. So I make an impassioned plea to the management to implement FMEA, but I always get armed with data, such as, if I can get it, the amount of warranty expense that they have, because that will significantly be reduced by well-done FMEAs. Great question. Who else has a question?
Next question. See one over there.
Yes, thanks, Carl. I have a question about keeping FMEAs alive, sort of.
Okay.
So once you create a document, so you have a baseline. So my question is specifically for instance, impact and severity, those ratings. Would you update them as the project continues? Would you keep the baseline always as is? Initially, or maybe you have some other also advice, recommendations on how to keep the document alive, practical tips.
I do. That's a great question. Thank you so much for that. For a given project, I like to do FMEAs at different stages. So update them. I'm saying you start out early on to get the FMEA done. I keep a record of it. Now this is up to company policy, but I do think it's good to have a record of the initial FMEA, so you could call that version 1. Then you can update during the product development process because you'll discover new failures or there'll be product changes. So you want that FMEA to represent the design or the process going right up until launch. Now, the other part of the question is, what do you do about then once you've launched? Do you keep the FMEA alive throughout the product life? And the answer is it depends. And this is going to depend on company policy. You can do that, but you have to be careful about variants, because if you have multiple variants of a product, which variant do you update? And so sometimes companies use what's called generic FMEAs, and they say, here's the generic FMEA. We're going to keep that up to date at all times. And then when you start the new FMEA on a new change, you can begin with the generic and then update it based on the changes. So I've given you a few things to think about. One is I would keep it alive during product development, and then you can consider based on your company policy whether you update it as a generic FMEA or update each of the variants depending on what fails in the field or in the plant later. So thank you for that question. Great question. Who else has a question?
Other questions. I see one up there.
Hey. Yep.
Yeah, one moment, Carl.
So don't be bashful, be thinking about questions. We have time for maybe one or two more.
Yeah, we still have 4 minutes for questions, so we can do 2.
First of all, thanks, Carl. I would like to ask one question which is not exactly for FMEA, that's connected with FMECA.
Sure.
Based on the FMEA, when we need to consider the result need to further process to the criticality ranking, which is FMECA.
Yeah, okay, very good. So this depends on customer. Usually, and let me explain to the audience, FMECA, FMECA, basically adds a layer of criticality analysis that can be defined by standards. And many FMEA procedures already include a criticality component to it. So sometimes an FMEA already has the criticality analysis. Other times it's done separately by contract. So I just wanted to explain that. But when you do I like to do criticality analysis by risk prioritization. And in other words, understanding which failure modes are most critical and least critical. So I always use some type of criticality analysis. We used to use RPN, that's the simplest. You can use S times O, that's another way. You can use an action table that looks at the different combinations of SOD, or you could use the more complicated procedure that is defined in some, mathematically defined in some standards. I won't go into it here. All of that is possible, but it's going to depend on your customer or your contract. I think FMEA procedure is good by itself, so I don't automatically do FMECA unless it's required. Okay, great question.
Yep, thanks.
Yeah,
Okay,
anybody else?
Final question, last one.
Last one. Here we go, right in the front.
Here in the front.
Yeah, go running down the aisle.
Run in, but safely. This is a
Safely.
risk management
Don't-
seminar after all.
Okay, don't trip.
Carl, perhaps a question to you. I'm also working with FMEAs, but what's in my mind is that if you do failure mode in effect analysis, then of course you define failure modes. And what I found out is that the way you do the FMEA can be done in different ways. Because if I ask my students also to do it on a bike, can be done in many ways. Do you also have some advices to come to a more standardized process also on how you define the exact failure mode? So also the wording or the language you use.
Absolutely correct. And I do have advice on this. And thank you for that. That's a good question to end off this particular presentation. So I want your definitions for all the different elements of FMEA to be very good definitions. So, and I'll help out with that at no charge to anybody, obviously. In my Inside FMEA series, I write one article for every element of FMEA: function, failure mode, effect, cause, controls, recommended actions, all the different elements. And I define it very simply. I'll also define it in my book in chapter 3, the definitions, but I want the team to understand what's meant. So for instance, failure mode is the manner in which the item does not accomplish the function. So in that case, we have to know what item means, we have to know what function means, and the failure mode is the manner in which it doesn't accomplish it. But that's just an example. Every element of the FMEA has to be understood by the team. The facilitator has to understand it the best, because the facilitator will say, wait a minute, that's not the definition. And so we want to stay faithful to the definitions. And the best way to do that is to study them over and over. You can't really study them too much. I'm still learning how to apply FMEA after all these years. So I think we've reached, thank you for that question. I think we've reached the time limit. So I want to really appreciate the dialogue with the audience and appreciate your attention to this important subject. And I wish you very good best wishes for high quality FMEAs. Thank you very much.